That afternoon stretched longer than usual, not because the sun was slow to set, but because the house was filled with a tension so rigid that even breathing felt excessive. Nadine Cross stood in the middle of the sitting room where the dark wooden walls had witnessed years of business dealings and negotiations rather than moments of family closeness, and she knew that from this moment on nothing would return to what it had been, even though she had not yet spoken a single word. The proposal had just been placed on the table, neat, reasonable, stripped of unnecessary emotion, exactly like the man who delivered it. The man facing Nadine possessed everything a family like the Crosses had been taught to value: a well-known name in the region's business circles, connections wide enough to open doors others had to knock on for years, and a future already drafted in stable figures, clean contracts, and a secure position in a society that showed little mercy to those who stepped outside its approved lines. He did not look at Nadine as a woman to be won, but as a piece that needed to be set in the right place so the picture would appear complete to those watching. Her father sat leaning slightly forward, both hands resting on his knees, carrying the posture of a man long accustomed to deciding for the entire family, to weighing benefit against risk, and to believing his experience sufficient to shield the rest from costly mistakes. He had nodded several times throughout the conversation, not out of joy, but out of relief, as though he had finally found a sensible escape from the pressures bearing down on the ranch, on the family name, and on the future he had always believed it was his duty to protect. Nadine listened in silence, not because she lacked words, but because every argument presented was painfully familiar, so familiar she had heard them repeated in many forms throughout her life. Whenever people looked at her with both expectation and quiet worry that she would refuse to stay in the place prepared for her. She understood that this proposal was not a sudden gesture of feeling, but the result of private discussions, careful calculations, and a long-held belief that marriage, if chosen correctly, could solve many problems at once. When Nadine finally refused, her voice did not rise or tremble. It was steady and clear, the same voice she used whenever she made decisions in her work. The room fell into a heavy silence, dense enough that the faint creak of aging wood under years of strain could be heard. The man across from her froze for a moment, not out of hurt, but because his plan had slipped off course. Her father rose abruptly, disappointment etched across a face deeply lined by worry, and in his eyes there was no space for understanding, only the sense of being betrayed by the very child he believed he had sacrificed everything to protect. He accused her of selfishness, of failing to grasp the position that she was placing the family in, of not seeing that given their standing and circumstances, refusing such an offer was no different from closing the last doors still open to them. The heaviest charge came last, delivered slowly, and with a painful certainty. Nadine was too stubborn, too confident in her own ability, and incapable of thinking about her father, about the years he had carried the weight alone to keep the ranch from collapsing under the pressures of a changing world. Nadine remained still. She did not defend herself or explain, because she understood that in this moment all reasoning was useless. What she was rejecting was not only a man, but an entire system of belief her father had clung to his whole life. The belief that safety was always worth more than freedom, and that a woman, no matter how capable, ultimately needed to be placed under the protection of a choice sanctioned by society. She left the house without a word, stepping into the yard, where the late light had turned a deep gold, carrying the familiar scent of earth and dry grass, the scent tied to the days she had worked from dawn until nightfall, to run this ranch in her father's place without complaint and without reliance on anyone else. A light wind passed through, yet Nadine felt a tightness in her chest, not from fear of what lay ahead, but from the realization that for the first time in her life, within her own home, within the family, she had worked so hard to hold together. She had been reduced to a burden, not because she had failed, but because she had refused to become a convenient solution for others. And that feeling, quiet, sharp, and unyielding, followed her past the threshold, foretelling a journey where every choice from this point forward would carry a cost, whether it proved right or wrong. Morning came early in this land, earlier than permission or hesitation, and Nadine Cross was used to stepping outside while dew still clung to the grass, when the light was only just enough to tell the worn path from ground that had not yet dried after the long night. She went straight to the desk set against the window, where ledgers were stacked one atop another, not as a symbol of authority, but as proof of a responsibility that could not be allowed to drift even a single step. The figures before her were not difficult to understand, but they carried their own weight because every line was tied to a decision already made, an unspoken promise to the hired hands, and her father's belief that everything was still within control. Nadine reviewed every expense, every shipment, every delivery schedule, not because she enjoyed command, but because she knew that any mistake, no matter how small, would not be seen merely as professional error, but as the clearest evidence that long-held doubts had been justified. She ran this ranch for her father, taking on the work he no longer had the strength to follow, day by day, yet it was never considered her own. That fact made every decision stricter because failure, if it came, would not belong to her alone. Outside work began along familiar lines. The hired men greeted her with brief nods, no flattery, no probing, accustomed to Nadine's presence as a natural part of the workday, requiring no verbal proof. She assigned tasks one by one, her voice calm and clear, not loud, but steady enough to be followed. In those moments, no one mentioned the argument from the night before, no one asked what she had refused, because work, as always, did not wait for anyone's feelings. Pressure followed Nadine through the morning, not as open criticism, but as an invisible layer of air, reminding her that every step was being weighed, not only by those outside, but by her father watching from a distance, close enough not to interfere, yet not far enough to let go. If she did well, it was merely expected. If she erred, it would confirm that safer paths, better choices had been dismissed without care. The accident happened when Nadine believed everything was under control. The horse faltered as the front wheel of the supply wagon sank into an unfilled rut, and in that brief instant, she lost her balance, her body pitching forward with a momentum she could not correct in time. The fall was not hard, not enough to cause serious injury, but enough to leave her dizzy enough to make the ground beneath her back feel cold and solid in a way that could not be denied. She lay still for a few seconds, not from pain, but to steady her breathing, to be sure she could stand on her own without anyone witnessing that moment of weakness. That was when a shadow fell over her, unhurried, unalarmed, and a hand was offered, not too close, not too far, as though the man extending it understood the boundaries of proper help. "Can you get up?" he asked, his voice low and even. Jonah Hale stood there, tall, lean, his face carrying the quiet of a man accustomed to working alone. His eyes did not sweep over her in judgment, nor linger in curiosity. Nadine nodded and took his hand. The support was measured, no pulling, no holding longer than necessary. When she stood upright, Jonah released her at once and stepped back half a pace, allowing her to assess herself. He did not ask why she was there so early, did not question her role on the ranch, and showed no interest in anything beyond what had just occurred. "Thank you," Nadine said, her voice rough from the fall. Jonah nodded once. "That patch of ground's slick. Best be careful there." Nadine looked at him for a brief moment, not to memorize his features, but to register something difficult to name, a respect that required no words, a presence without demand or expectation. When she turned back to her work, her head still slightly unsteady, but her steps firmer. Nadine did not know that from that moment on, things would begin to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way pressure always builds little by little before forcing a person to face the choices they have made. Jonah Hale brought Nadine Cross back to the ranch in a morning when the sun had climbed high enough to expose details people usually chose to overlook. The dirt road leading to the main house ran between patches of grass, long accustomed to hoof prints and wagon wheels, and Jonah kept his pace slightly slower, not because Nadine asked, but because he noticed she was still faintly unsteady even though her stride had settled back into its usual firmness, as if nothing had happened. When the wooden gate opened, a ranch hand approached out of habit. His eyes paused briefly on Nadine, then shifted to Jonah, as if to assess the situation. Nadine gave a small nod, her voice calm. "I'm fine. Get the midday delivery ready again." The man replied shortly, and turned away without further questions or curiosity. Jonah noticed, and there was a quiet recognition in his gaze not of authority, but of the way Nadine was obeyed without explanation. Inside the house, Nadine stopped at the door to the workroom and turned to Jonah. "If you're not in a hurry, you're welcome to tea. I need to sit for a moment." Jonah nodded. "All right." The room was not large, but orderly in the way of someone long used to responsibility. Morning light came through the window, falling across file shelves, land maps marked in pale ink, and a scarred wooden desk in the corner. Nadine set the kettle down with a practiced motion. She poured the tea without asking whether he wanted it, as if the invitation itself had already answered that question. Jonah sat across from her, leaning back in his chair. His eyes did not roam the room the way visitors often did when measuring value or advantage. Instead, they rested on Nadine as she opened a ledger, wrote a few lines, then rose to retrieve another stack of papers. "You don't plan to rest longer?" he asked, his voice low without reproach. "If I rest, the work will still be there," Nadine replied, not looking up. "And I don't like leaving it waiting." Jonah gave a small nod and said nothing more. He watched quietly as she worked how she called a ranch hand, waiting outside, gave brief instructions about moving the herd and adjusting the delivery schedule, then dismissed him with a firm nod. There was no hesitation, no space left for argument. When the room held only the two of them again, Jonah spoke as though choosing his moment carefully. "How long have you been running things here since my father couldn't keep up anymore?" Nadine said. "I just handle what's left." Jonah studied her a second longer, then asked easily, "So, this isn't your ranch?" Nadine closed the ledger. "No, I only manage it." He did not react, no surprise, no doubt, only took the information as something to note. Then Jonah spoke of himself plainly. "I came from the east," he said. "Land's crowded there. I'm looking for a place to invest in a ranch, long-term if possible. Not the sort you buy and turn over." Nadine looked at him, her gaze sharp but open. "And you think there's still room in the west for someone coming in late?" Jonah lifted one shoulder slightly. "I think if you work long enough, the land will answer." There was no display of confidence in the words, no promise. They were simple, like the way he had stood there since morning, never pushing forward, never pressing a claim. Nadine turned back to her desk and continued sorting papers. She was aware Jonah's attention remained not fixed on her as something out of place, but on her as someone doing exactly what needed to be done. He followed the way she gave direction, the way she handled questions as they arose. Throughout it all, Jonah offered no advice and made no attempt to show superior knowledge. At last, when Nadine closed the final file, Jonah spoke again, his voice low, almost as if meant for himself, but clear enough for her to hear. "You're doing well." Nadine paused, her hand resting on the desk's edge. She did not ask what he based that on, nor did she deflect the comment as she usually did when faced with careless praise. The words did not arrive as judgment, but as a simple acknowledgement, asking nothing of her in return. "You say that because you haven't seen me make a mistake," she said, half in jest. Jonah met her gaze direct. "No. I say it because you know what you're doing." In that moment, Nadine felt herself slow. For the first time, she did not feel the need to prove she belonged where she stood. No extra words were required. No defense of her choices. No explanation for her presence in that room. Jonah's presence carried no question, and that absence, more than any compliment, made the space feel easier to breathe than she had ever expected. The afternoon settled over the ranch in a quiet that felt uneasy. The late sunlight was no longer harsh, only slanting through the sitting room window, where Nadine's father was receiving a guest she did not need to see to recognize. The man who had once proposed to her sat across from him, posture, straight coat, neatly pressed hands folded with practiced calm. His voice was courteous, measured, as if each word had been weighed to ensure no one felt cornered. Things must be difficult at the ranch lately. He began, his gaze resting on the old photographs, lining the wall, where the family's history was arranged, with careful order like a reminder. The market's unstable. The weather's unpredictable. I just think, perhaps your family shouldn't have to shoulder everything alone. Her father remained silent, shoulders heavy from years of holding the line. He listened without objecting, without agreeing, letting those words of concern seep in as a possible path through very real fears. Nadine stood on the threshold inside the house, neither entering nor leaving. She knew this language. It was never blunt, never commanding, yet every sentence laid groundwork for a condition still to come. The man continued, his tone, still gentle. He spoke of capital, of connections, of sharing management, to ease the burden on her father. He never said Nadine's name, but every proposal revolved around the idea that she should step back, allow someone else to carry the larger decisions. Her father rubbed his forehead lightly, his eyes wavering. The fear of losing everything was plain, the fear of a man long used to standing at the front, now worried his daughter would be the one to pay the price if he let her continue. Footsteps sounded on the porch, cutting through the weight of thought. Jonah Hale appeared with a basket of apples in his hands, sunlight still clinging to their skins. He stopped at the door long enough to sense the room was not open to outsiders. Both men turned. Their eyes passed over Jonah, unable to hide a faint irritation, as if his presence disrupted an order just being set. Jonah nodded in greeting, simple, without explanation. He did not step fully inside, only stood there like a man bringing something small and without ambition. Nadine stepped forward to take the basket. In that moment, Jonah caught her expression, not anger, not defiance, just the tired look of someone trapped in a conversation whose ending had already been drawn. She took the basket, her fingers tightening slightly, as if she needed a small anchor to stay upright. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonah did not ask what was being discussed. He did not need to. He inclined his head and lowered his voice so the question would not turn into an interruption. "Would you like to step outside for a bit? The breeze behind the house is cooler." The room behind them faltered for a beat. Nadine's father looked up, surprised. The other man lifted his brows slightly, as if unable to believe such a simple offer could intrude on a negotiation taking shape. Nadine met Jonah's eyes only for an instant. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said, "I would." She turned and walked with Jonah without asking permission, without explaining, leaving behind two men still seated in quiet confusion. Outside, the wind moved across the fields, carrying the scent of dry grass and warm earth. Nadine drew a deep breath as though stepping out of a room that had been sealed too long. They walked side by side, unhurried. Jonah kept a respectful distance, not pressing her to speak. "The apples are from the eastern orchard," he said softly. "Good year for them." Nadine smiled faintly. "Is it? Yeah," he replied. "Probably because someone's been tending the land carefully." She let out a short laugh, brief but enough to loosen the weight. Then silence settled again, not uncomfortable, just space for thoughts to breathe. Nadine looked toward the fence stretching to the edge of the field. "Have you ever felt like you were being discussed as an option?" she asked, not turning toward him. Jonah slowed half a step. "Yes," he said, "and I don't like that feeling." She nodded as if something private had just been confirmed. Behind them, through the window, her father and the other man still stood watching, their surprise not yet faded. Nadine kept walking beside Jonah, and in that moment she understood that sometimes the most important choice is not agreeing to or refusing a reasonable offer, but allowing yourself to step away from it even if only to breathe, even if only for a moment. Jonah began stopping by Nadine's workspace more often without announcement and without noise. He came on evenings when the light in the office was still on, and the door remained slightly open out of habit. He carried the scent of night wind and road dust, set his hat on the chair near the door, and waited until she looked up. There were no questions about why he had come, no explanations for why he stayed. The two of them had grown used to each other's presence in a way that felt natural, as if these late nights had always been meant for two. The ledgers lay open on the desk, papers stacked low, not neat, but ordered in Nadine's own way. She had worked the fields all day, returned with the smell of dry grass still on her hands, and now faced numbers that made her head ache. Jonah stood across from her, leaned slightly to look over her shoulder, his voice low and unhurried as he pointed to a line of notes. Here. You counted this twice. Nadine let out a short breath, as if pulled back from a dead end. I knew I was missing something, she said, rubbing her forehead. The more I look, the worse it gets. You're pushing yourself too hard, Jonah said. Not as criticism, only observation. When your eyes are tired, every number looks the same. She glanced at him and half a smile, half worn down. You say that like you've never been there. Jonah shrugged. I have. And I paid for it. Silence settled again, not the kind that weighs on a room, but one that feels like a thin blanket laid gently over everything, keeping it warm and contained. Outside, the wind moved through the wooden hallways, drawing familiar creaks from a house that had lived with this family for many years. Nadine turned a page. Her pen hovered longer than needed, as if she were weighing something that had nothing to do with figures. Jonah broke the quiet with a statement that seemed to come from nowhere. I'll be leaving. Nadine looked up. Leaving where? Here, he said, one hand resting on the desk's edge. I don't know where I'll go next. I just know I can't stay long. She did not ask why at once. Some questions need time or they turn into careless curiosity. Jonah took a slow breath as if feeling his way through his own words. There are places, he went on, where staying only makes you remember too much. And waking up every day feels like tearing open the same old wound. Nadine watched him closely. For the first time, she saw the sadness in him, unspoken, unperformed, running quiet, like water beneath the ground. I thought you liked drifting, she said softly. I used to think that, Jonah replied, until I realized I was just running. The words hung between them. Nadine returned to the ledgers, but the numbers had gone distant. She understood that feeling better than most, staying somewhere not out of desire but obligation, leaving not for freedom but because of pain. Two ways of living that seemed opposite yet stood strangely close. When Jonah bent to show her a calculation, his hand brushed hers. Not firm, not sudden, just a small moment. But both of them felt it. Nadine did not pull away at once. Neither did Jonah. They stood like that, breaths sharing the soft yellow light. Time slowed just enough for her to notice her heartbeat shift, just enough for him to understand that some things did not need words to be real. Sorry, Jonah said at last without moving. It's all right, Nadine replied, her voice steadier than the feeling spreading through her chest. They separated slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile that had just taken shape. The work went on, but it was no longer the same. Each silence now carried an added weight. Each meeting of their eyes lingered a fraction longer. Outside the hallway, Nadine's father paused by the office door. He did not enter. He only looked through the narrow opening. He saw Jonah there, saw his daughter leaning in to listen, saw a closeness so slight, yet clear enough for a man who had lived long to recognize. He said nothing. He turned away quietly, carrying an unspoken worry and a question not yet ready to be asked. Inside the room, Nadine closed the ledger and released a breath. "That's it," she said. Jonah nodded. "You did well." The words were not praise in the usual sense. They felt like a quiet acknowledgement for everything she carried and for what she had never allowed herself to admit. Nadine stood and looked at him, and in that moment she understood that these nights of working together were not only about ledgers or duty. They were where two people were learning to see each other's sorrow and not turn away. Nadine's father called her into his study after night had fully settled at the hour when family conversations no longer allowed for detours. The oil lamp on the desk cast its familiar dull gold light, tracing deeper lines into his face, lines earned through difficult seasons and years of holding things together. He did not raise his voice. He only looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to name a worry he himself was not yet ready to face. "I've heard people talking about you and Jonah," he said. At last, his voice low and tired. "You're not as discreet as you think." Nadine stood still, her hands folded before her, not in the posture of a child being scolded, but of someone long accustomed to standing firm behind her own decisions. She answered with the calm she had trained herself into over many years. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Maybe not," her father replied, "but you're putting yourself in a position that makes people think you're no longer focused on the ranch, and I can't allow that." The words, though indirect, struck the place Nadine was always forced to brace. For the first time in days, she explained herself without full restraint, said that Jonah was not the problem, that it was the pressure and the half-spoken deals circling them that were pushing everything out of reach. The conversation rose quickly, voices overlapping, until her father spoke the sentence that brought the room to complete stillness. "You have to understand," he said slowly. "You don't have the right to be weak. Not now." The words landed like a judgment. Nadine did not argue again. She left the house in silence and went straight to the stables where the night lay thick enough to hide what she did not want seen. Her familiar horse gave a soft sound as she mounted. Without further thought, she urged it forward, letting wind and darkness swallow the thoughts colliding in her mind. Jonah's cabin stood apart, its single light ahead, like an anchor in the wide night. When Nadine dismounted, her legs trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but because she had finally allowed herself not to stand rigid. Jonah opened the door at the sound of her steps. His eyes met hers and held. He did not ask questions, did not show surprise. He simply stepped aside and let her in. Inside, the fire in the stove had burned low, leaving warmth gentle enough to stay. Nadine stood in the middle of the room, her coat still carrying road dust, and for a moment she did not know what to say. Jonah pulled a chair closer to the stove, set it down, and sat across from her as if the space had already been prepared for this moment. She began to speak without order, fragments of the argument, the pressure, the sentence that had forced her back into an old position, the one who must always hold herself upright to prove she deserves to stand. Jonah did not interrupt. He listened, his eyes steady on her, never forcing her to meet his gaze. When Nadine's voice grew rough and her breathing broke, Jonah finally stood and stepped closer. He lifted a hand and brushed away a tear she had not noticed falling. His fingers touched her cheek, then moved slowly to the edge of her coat. A careful gesture, patient, as if asking permission through restraint itself. Nadine did not step back. She looked up, met his eyes, and in that silence neither of them had to be strong. Jonah leaned in and kissed her lightly, unhurried, without claim. The kiss did not come from impulse, but from the moment they both understood they were standing on the narrow line between staying and leaving. Nadine answered not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone choosing for the first time without needing justification. The night passed in a rare quiet. No promises, no vows, no talk of tomorrow. Only a closeness that allowed Nadine to feel she had not grown weaker here, only that for once she did not have to hold herself rigid in order to exist. Jonah stayed with her not as a rescuer, but as someone who had chosen to remain long enough for her to rest against him without losing herself. When the fire had faded to embers, Nadine lay still, listening to Jonah's steady breathing, and understood that this night was not a retreat. It was a necessary pause, a place where she was allowed to be herself, not the bearer of responsibility, not a solution for anyone else, just a woman who was seen and chosen in silence. Morning came to the ranch with a light that was clear yet cold, not from wind, but from the things left unsaid already hanging in the air. Nadine's father rose earlier than usual, out of habit formed by a man who never allowed himself even a single morning of ease. As he passed through the hallway, he sensed a missing rhythm in the house. The study was dark, its door still closed. Nadine's room showed no sign of a late return. He stopped, his hand resting on the doorframe, as if he needed something solid to confirm what he was already thinking. Nadine had not come home the night before. She had not stayed late in the study either, as she often did when work piled up. The absence was quiet, but clear enough to tell a seasoned father that something had slipped beyond his control. He stepped onto the porch and looked out across the dew-soaked fields where the dirt road leading toward Jonah Hale's isolated cabin disappeared behind a line of low trees. The thought came slowly, but once it did, it held fast, dragging with it a familiar suspicion, another man about to complicate everything. When Nadine returned, the sun had climbed a little higher. She passed through the gate with a steady step, neither avoiding the moment nor rushing to explain. Jonah followed a few paces behind, keeping enough distance to avoid creating anything that required justification. He nodded to the ranch hands, preparing for the morning, then stopped at the edge of the yard, not going any farther. The restraint was not retreat, but a conscious choice, as if he understood exactly where he should stand. Nadine's father appeared on the steps. He did not ask at once. His eyes moved over his daughter, then settled on Jonah, quick, cool assessment, not hostile. "Where were you last night?" he asked. His voice was not raised, but it carried enough weight to turn the question into a reminder of responsibility. Nadine drew in a breath and met his gaze. "I didn't come home," she said, "and I wasn't in the study." A pause stretched between them. The wind stirred the wooden door behind them like a quiet sigh. Her father gave a slight nod, not agreement, but confirmation of what he had already suspected. "I don't want this ranch pulled into gossip," he said. "We're carrying enough trouble as it is." Jonah remained still, not stepping in, his eyes lowered to the ground. He did not move forward or turn away. He simply stayed where he was. Nadine noticed, and for the first time that morning, she did not feel caught between two sides. She stepped forward one pace, enough for her father to hear clearly, not an act of defiance. "I don't need to be protected," she said, her voice low and steady. "I only need to be trusted." The words were not loud or sharp, but they cut straight into what both of them had long avoided. Her father looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for an opening to argue, then realizing there was none. This time Nadine was not speaking from impulse or rebellion. She spoke like someone who had considered long enough to know exactly where she stood. "Trusted," he repeated slowly. "And if you're wrong, then I bear it," Nadine answered without hesitation. "Like I do with every other decision." Jonah lifted his head just slightly. His eyes brushed Nadine, then moved away as if he did not want to claim the moment. He spoke quietly for only those nearby to hear. "I'll come back later." Nadine turned to him and nodded. No appointment, no promise. Jonah walked off, leaving the yard with a straight back and an unhurried step, leaving behind a space that was quiet but unmistakable. Her father watched him for a few seconds, then turned back to Nadine. "Do you know what people will think?" he asked. "I do," Nadine said. But I also know that if I keep living to avoid those thoughts, I won't be myself anymore. Silence settled again. No one won. No one lost. Only a boundary had been redrawn, not with promises, but with acknowledgement. Her father turned back into the house, his pace slower than usual. Nadine remained where she was, watching him go, feeling something new take shape between them. Not agreement, but enough space for each of them to breathe. When she turned toward the fields, the light had warmed. Work was waiting as always. But this morning was different. For the first time, Nadine did not feel she had to hide part of the truth to keep the surface calm. She walked on with a rare steadiness, knowing that even if the road ahead was unclear, she had spoken the most important thing. She did not need anyone to stand in front of her, only someone who trusted that she could stand on her own. The scheme did not arrive with loud noise, nor did it take the shape of an open confrontation. It appeared through letters delivered right on time, meetings arranged with careful timing, and advice that sounded at first hearing like goodwill. The man who had once proposed to Nadine began returning more frequently each visit, carrying a reasonable excuse to sit down with her father. He always chose moments when Nadine was absent, as if he understood that certain negotiations moved more smoothly without the woman who had refused to step into the role prepared for her. Agreements were placed on the table, fresh ink, cautious wording that revealed no trace of threat. He spoke of debt, restructuring, of temporary transfers, of operational control to a more experienced management group, of the need to act quickly before the market grew harsher. Every sentence was wrapped in economic logic, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. No one was forced. No gun was held to anyone's head. Only the fear of losing everything was raised clearly enough that people signed of their own accord. Nadine's father held the pen for a long time. He reread each line, his tired eyes resting on clauses that seemed harmless, yet opened doors that would not easily close again. He knew that once he signed, the ranch would no longer belong entirely to the family, but he also knew that refusing might bring collapse sooner than he expected. It was the kind of choice that convinces a man he is protecting what matters most, even as he slowly hands it away. Nadine sensed something was wrong one afternoon when she reviewed payments and found figures that no longer aligned. Decisions had been made without her knowledge. Delivery schedules had been adjusted, nothing dramatic, but enough to throw the rhythm off. She stood at her desk for a long while, the familiar pressure returning this time, not from others' doubts, but from a system quietly shifting around her. Jonah arrived that evening as he usually did, carrying the calm of someone accustomed to observing from the outside. Nadine handed him the papers she had just uncovered. She said little, simply laid them on the desk like a silent invitation. Jonah read slowly, missing nothing. He did not react at once, no frown, no anger. When he folded the papers and looked up, his voice kept its steady pace. "They're pushing control out of your family's hands," he said. "Not all at once, but step by step." "My father thinks it's the only way," Nadine replied, her voice dry. "He's afraid of losing everything." Jonah nodded. "That's exactly what they want him to fear." He pulled a chair closer, took a pencil from his coat pocket, and began noting timelines. Small changes that formed a pattern. There was no blame, no accusation. Jonah analyzed it like someone familiar with soft power structures, where outcomes are decided not by force, but by patience and understanding. He pointed out how temporary clauses could become permanent, how a signature meant to save the ranch could later lock every exit. "We don't need force," he said, looking at Nadine. "And we shouldn't use it. This can only be undone with reason." Nadine listened as confusion gave way to the focus she knew well. She realized Jonah was not there to take control nor to decide for her. He simply laid everything out clearly, allowing her to see the full picture others were trying to blur. Under the yellow lamplight of the office, the two sat across from each other, not as host and guest, but as two people facing the same problem. We need time, Nadine said slowly. And we need my father to see this isn't the only path. Jonah nodded. And we'll need proof not to argue with him, but to show that this choice will take more than it promises to give. For the first time since it began, Nadine did not feel she was carrying it alone. Not because Jonah stood in front of her, nor because he shielded her from anything, but because he stood beside her, looking in the same direction. That quiet partnership was solid enough for her to trust her own judgment again. Outside, the ranch ran on as it always had. The hired hands worked. The horses were led back to the stables as night fell. No one knew control was being pulled away piece by piece, and no one knew that inside that small room a new line had just been drawn. Nadine and Jonah did not speak it aloud, but they both understood from this moment on they were no longer standing on parallel sides. They were standing together facing a battle that needed no guns, only clarity, patience, and the resolve not to be led by fear. That evening, the house settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that arrives when everyone knows a conversation is waiting and cannot be avoided. Nadine did not leave. She also did not stay late in the study, as she had on nights she wanted to avoid what was coming. She washed her hands, changed the shirt still carrying the scent of dust and earth, and walked straight into the sitting room, where her father sat alone with a stack of papers on the table. The lamplight sharpened the printed lines, making them look harsher than usual. He did not look up at once when he heard her steps. "You're still awake?" he asked, his voice tired, not cold. "I need to talk," Nadine said, pulling a chair across from him. She placed her hands on her lap, unfolded, not hiding the tension, as if reminding herself that this time she would not retreat. Her father sighed and finally looked at her. His gaze lingered longer than usual, as if trying to read whether she had come in impulse or with a decision already weighed. "If this is about those agreements," he said, "I have thought about them a great deal." "I know," Nadine replied. "That's why I'm here." She did not circle the point. She said plainly that she had reviewed the terms, understood what would happen if he signed, and knew that transferring operational control, whatever name it went by, would ultimately push her out of the position she carried every day. Her father frowned, answering with familiar arguments: safety, reputation, and a future with fewer risks. "You can't keep standing at the front forever," he said. "And marriage," Nadine cut in, not loudly, but firmly. "Forcing me to marry is the easiest solution, Father." The words stopped him short. Nadine went on, her voice steady, no longer guarded. "The easiest way for you to feel secure. The easiest way for others to stop questioning. And the fastest way for me to disappear inside my own life." Her father leaned back in his chair, as though hearing something he did not want to hear, yet could not deny. "I only want to protect you," he said, slower this time. "I know," Nadine answered, "but I don't need to be protected that way. I need to live." She spoke of the years she had stayed at the ranch, not out of blind duty, but because she believed the place was worth keeping. She spoke of hard decisions, sleepless nights, and the constant fear that a single mistake would undo everything, turning her efforts into proof that she had never truly belonged. She did not accuse him or assign blame. She simply placed the truth on the table, clear and unavoided. "I'm not leaving," Nadine said, meeting his eyes. "But I also won't give ground by trading myself away. If this ranch can only survive by pushing me aside, then perhaps we've misunderstood what it means to keep it at all." Silence filled the room. Her father looked down at the stack of papers, then back at his daughter, as if seeing for the first time the distance between what he feared and what she endured. He did not speak immediately. His hand rested on the contracts, then slowly drew back. "Do you know what I've been afraid of?" he asked at last. Nadine shook her head. "I'm afraid that if I don't choose the easier path, I'll lose you," he said. Lose you to battles I no longer have the strength to follow. Nadine took a deep breath. I'm not going anywhere, she said. But I can't live as if I'm a temporary solution to someone else's fear. Her father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had shifted, not full agreement, but less rigidity. I need time, he said. I'm not asking you to change overnight, Nadine replied. I only need you to look again. He gave a very slight nod, a small but meaningful acknowledgement. The papers still lay there, neither torn apart nor signed. Nadine stood without victory or defeat, only with the sense that something had been set in its proper place. She did not leave into the night or run from what followed. She stayed faced him and allowed her father to see that the harder choice was not always the wrong one. As she left the room, the lamp remained lit. Behind her, her father sat alone studying the papers with a different expression, the look of a man beginning to ask whether protection had turned into another form of harm, and whether his daughter was right in saying that sometimes the fastest way to keep what matters is to refuse the easiest path. The truth did not arrive as a sudden collapse. It revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, the way light slips into a room long used to shadow enough that no one could turn away and pretend they had not seen it. Nadine understood this when the first documents were laid on the table, not in a loud confrontation, but in a small meeting among people who trusted numbers more than promises. Jonah spoke little. He simply arranged the papers in chronological order, pointing out changes that appeared scattered, but were bound by a cold, consistent logic. Loans offered at just the right moment, addendums added after each hardship, the ranch faced advice that always led to the same outcome. Transfer control, concentrate decision-making in a group outside the Cross family. Not a single line mentioned feeling. Not a word spoke of shared futures. Power had been translated into the language of finance. As regional partners began to cross-check figures, questions surfaced. Not sharp, but persistent. Why did the same man appear in so many rescue deals? Why did ranches that accepted those offers slowly lose their autonomy? And why, in every negotiation, was Nadine Cross set aside as if she were a variable to be removed so the equation would come out clean? The man who had once proposed to Nadine kept his courteous tone when questioned. He spoke of market risk of responsibility borne by those able to carry it. This time his words no longer fell into a receptive silence. With enough light, people could see the shape of the darkness. Every offer of help pointed toward a single axis control. His reputation did not fall in a day. It fractured in the way most painful to a man who lived on social regard through silence. Invitations thinned, meetings were postponed. Eyes once warm grew cautious. No one needed to name his motives. The outcomes spoke clearly. This had never been a story of love or duty. It was an accumulation of power disguised by politeness. Nadine's father watched from closer than he had ever allowed himself to stand. He reread the clauses he had nearly signed now with the clarity of someone emerging from a long panic. The words that once looked like rescue now cut clean and sharp. He saw where he had wavered, not for lack of faith in his daughter, but because he had let fear lead for too long. That afternoon, he called Nadine into the room. No stacks of papers waited. Just 2 chairs and a softer light. He did not begin with an apology or a defense. He spoke slowly, choosing each word to avoid further harm to what was already thin. I was wrong, he said. Not about you, but about the easy road. Nadine listened without interrupting. She heard the fatigue in his voice, not the weight of labor, but the strain of admitting a mistake long masked as good intention. He spoke of fearing the loss of the ranch, of the pressure to preserve a legacy in changing times, and of how he had believed placing his daughter inside a safe frame was the only way to protect them both. You were never wrong, he said at last, meeting her eyes. I just wasn't brave enough to trust you sooner." The words did not lift her at once. They arrived late but necessary. Nadine did not seek victory in that moment. She only needed the truth set where it belonged. "I don't need you to agree with every choice I make," she said. "I just need you to see where I'm standing." He nodded. No grand promises, no vows, just the nod of a man who had looked back far enough to change how he stood. Outside, the ranch kept its daily rhythm. The hired hands did not know every detail, but they felt a slight shift in the air, decisions made faster, clearer, without haze. Jonah stood at the edge of the yard, not stepping in, not needing to be named in this unveiling. He understood some moments are not his, even when he helped make them possible. At sunset, Nadine stepped onto the porch and breathed in the familiar scent of earth. She felt no triumph, only a rare steadiness. The truth had been spoken not to punish, but to free. And in that steadiness, she understood the most important thing was not the fall of one man's reputation, but that she was no longer being used as an answer to someone else's fear. That afternoon moved slowly, not because anything remarkable happened, but because everything had reached a point where no one wished to push it further. Nadine's father stood on the porch watching the ranch hands lead the horses back to the stables. His gaze no longer carried the tight strain of recent days. He had grown used to seeing his daughter shoulder too much, so used to it that he once believed as long as she was strong enough, everything would hold. After what had been laid bare, he was forced to admit, what he had long avoided, that strength had come at the cost of Nadine's loneliness. Jonah Hale appeared at the end of the dirt road, unhurried, carrying none of the air of a man arriving to ask permission or stake a claim. He stopped in the yard, removed his hat, and nodded to Nadine's father with a direct respect, neither submissive nor elevated. Her father studied Jonah longer than usual, not to measure him, but to confirm something he had sensed early on. This man was not trying to take his daughter's life, but willing to stand beside it. "You wanted to talk?" her father asked. Jonah nodded. "Yes, if you'll allow it." They sat at the wooden table on the porch. There were no papers, no contracts, none of the familiar economic arguments. Jonah spoke slowly, one sentence at a time, without pressing his case. He spoke of wanting to invest in the ranch, not as a purchase, but as a decision to stay. He spoke of having traveled far enough to know some places are worth stopping for, and some people should not be left alone with every burden. "I'm not here to replace her position," Jonah said, meeting her father's eyes. "And I'm not here to control anything. I want to contribute so Nadine doesn't have to carry it all alone." Her father listened without interruption. He had heard too many offers wrapped in good intentions. But this was the first time he heard a man speak about standing still, neither stepping forward to take over, nor stepping back to avoid responsibility. When Jonah mentioned marriage, his tone did not change. He did not elevate the moment or use it as a key to authority. "If Nadine agrees," Jonah said, "I'd like to invest through a proposal, not to legitimize anything, but to share responsibility." Her father did not answer at once. He looked toward the fields where his daughter stood, checking the fence, her familiar figure within the land that had raised them all. He realized then that what Nadine needed was not a man strong enough to take care of her in the old sense, but one steady enough not to turn her into a burden or a prize. Nadine approached as the conversation neared its end. She had not heard everything, but she saw the subtle shift in her father's eyes. Jonah turned toward her. He did not stand immediately. He only looked as if waiting for her to arrive at her own pace. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly, for her alone, "not to fix anything, but to walk with you." Nadine stood before him for the first time without raising any defenses. She was used to being seen as a pillar, a solution, someone who had to be strong enough not to disappoint anyone. In Jonah's eyes now she saw no expectation and no demand, only a choice placed cleanly in her hands. "I don't need someone to come fix my life," she said. I need someone who knows I've been standing on my own for a long time. Jonah nodded. I know. And I still want to stay. The proposal did not unfold the way stories usually tell it. No kneeling. No ornate vows. Just a direct question spoken in the soft afternoon light when everything was quiet enough not to require display. Nadine felt a different kind of stirring, not from being chosen, but from being seen at last as a woman, not a symbol of strength, not a weight of responsibility, but a person allowed to share. She nodded slowly, without haste. I agree, she said. Not because she needed escape, but because she saw a path that did not demand she give herself up. Her father rose and stepped closer. He looked at Jonah, then at his daughter, and finally nodded. Not the nod of surrender, but of recognition. He understood that from this moment on, Nadine did not lose control of her life. She simply would not have to carry it alone. The evening wind crossed the porch, bringing the familiar scent of earth and grass. Jonah stood there, neither advancing to claim nor retreating to avoid. He stood still. And that stillness, more than any promise, said everything that mattered. Life afterward did not change in the way people expect from stories with a proper ending. It did not become easier simply because Nadine and Jonah now stood on the same side, nor did the tired days disappear just because people began calling them a family. But one thing changed clearly from the very first mornings. Nadine no longer had to carry everything alone. Jonah entered the rhythm of the ranch, not through grand declarations, but through steady, quiet labor, heavy work done without being asked, without needing notice. He handled the stables, the fences, the long-distance deliveries, and days in the fields that stretched into late afternoon. Nadine remained with the ledgers with decisions that required clarity more than strength, with coordination and calculation to keep everything running smoothly. They did not divide roles as one above and one below. They divided them by ability, by each person's natural pace. That balance made the work lighter in a way no shortcut ever could. Nadine's father observed from a distance, close enough to see the change, and far enough not to interfere. He saw that his daughter no longer carried the same exhaustion, no longer stayed up late to compensate for what was lacking. He also saw that Jonah never tried to claim the center, never turned his presence into a condition for things to continue. Everything unfolded as if this had always been the proper order, only it had taken them far too long to learn how to trust it. When Nadine became pregnant, the ranch moved into a slower rhythm, not because it weakened, but because it learned when to pause. Jonah grew more careful in his work, without saying a word, adjusting on his own. Nadine continued working, but no longer tried to prove she could outrun every limit. She allowed her body to be heard, allowed tired days to pass without self-blame. And in the quiet evenings, sitting side by side on the porch, without needing many words, Nadine understood that strength was not never needing another person, but knowing where one could lean without losing oneself. The child was born on a morning with nothing remarkable about it, except that the light felt gentler than usual. When Nadine's father held his grandchild for the first time, he stood for a long while without speaking, as though piecing together everything that had come before. He looked at the child, then at his daughter, and in that moment he understood something he had never allowed himself to admit before. The day Nadine refused that earlier marriage had not been reckless. It had been the truest decision she could make, not only for herself, but for this family. He placed a hand on her shoulder, awkward but sincere. You were right, he said, his voice low and slow. No explanation was needed. Nadine smiled, not because of belated approval, but because that approval was no longer something she needed in order to live. Years passed. The ranch grew in a steady, unshowy way. Seasons followed one another. Fences were rebuilt. Children grew up among grass and wind. Nadine and Jonah continued working side by side, still disagreeing, at times still facing hard days, But no one was forced into the role of sacrifice just to keep everything standing. They built their family not on loud promises, but on choices repeated every day. One afternoon, many years later, as the sun slanted down over fields long familiar, Nadine stood on the porch, watching her children run, their laughter rising and dissolving into the wind. Jonah was farther out, repairing a stretch of fence, his movements calm and known like the land itself. Her father sat nearby, hands resting on his cane, watching his family with a rare and settled peace. Nadine understood then that her life had not begun with love, nor had it been saved by a properly sanctioned marriage. It began the moment she dared to say no to the easier road, dared to stay and face what stood before her, dared to believe she deserved to be seen without needing to be given away. And in that fading afternoon light, she knew the most important thing she would leave her children was not a thriving ranch or a quiet home, but a silent lesson. A woman's worth does not lie in how she is chosen, but in her right to choose and still be respected. If you're listening to this story and find yourself remembering an old decision, a time you chose what was hard instead of what was easy, or a woman in your life who carried more than she was ever thanked for, we invite you to share in the comments. Those memories, even when distant, deserve to be heard. If this story brought you a moment of warmth or calm, please tap like to support the channel. And if you'd like to continue walking with these slow stories made for hearts that have weathered many seasons, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. We truly value your presence, and we look forward to meeting you again in the next story.